Hi there, nice to be with you. Happy you could stick around.
1, 2, 3, kick. Come on, everybody. Clap your hands. Ooh, you're looking good. Are you having a good time? Yeah. I sure am.
Hi, it's Ira Robbins. I am the host of the Trouser Press Books Podcast, and welcome to our latest edition. This time we are speaking to Dan Beck, the author of You've Got Michael, a brand new book about his years at Epic Records working with Michael Jackson. Welcome, Dan.
Oh, thank you, Ira. Great to be here with you.
So about 1 million years ago, I was publishing Trouser Press magazine, and you were an executive at Epic Records, and we had some interaction, although I don't recall anything about it. I mean, it was probably either about The Clash or Cheap Trick. Those would be the two Epic artists that would have mattered the most to me, although I suppose Jeff Beck might have mattered as well. But
absolutely, and I product managed all of them.
30-some-odd years later, I get an email from you saying, I hope you remember me. I used to be at Epic Records, and I've got this book that I've written about Michael Jackson. Would you be interested in publishing it? And I read it. I thought it was great, and here we are.
Trouser Press Books really fulfilled every intention I had for the book. I really didn't want to put it out through a big publisher, too glossy. I didn't want that image because there'd always been so much hype around Michael that I thought if it's understated, and also with the credibility that you had with Trouser Press, I knew the industry people, that would be a signal to people in the music business that, hey, this is a serious book. It's not some glitzy thing like so much around Michael.
It's funny because, I mean, Michael Jackson is certainly not somebody that the Trouser Press universe ever embraced as an artist. I mean, pop was never really our thing when we were in the magazine. And in what I've done with Trouser Press Books so far, some of it's been pop. I mean, the Arista book is certainly a pop book, but, a lot of it's been, different. I didn't have any concern about the subject matter because I thought it was such an interesting book and such a unique perspective on somebody who's been written about, millions and millions of words, but in only a couple of obvious ways. The biographies, the sort of the scandalous books. Bob Jones was his publicist.
Yes.
And he wrote a book that apparently was a tell-all that made everybody unhappy.
Yeah. I don't know what the fallout was with Bob and Michael. Bob was like the guard dog for forever, and really was kind of came in the picture with Joe Jackson, so he was of that generation. Mm-hmm. But I think as Michael got older, it was like, I don't need somebody who still thinks I'm a child, thinks I'm 5 years old,
right.
And so they had a falling out, and I think Bob just turned really negative.
But your book is nothing like that. Your book is about the day-to-day working to create and market the History album and to work on the
Dangerous album. Yeah.
For young people, the idea that the record industry once existed as a business of physical product that had to be pressed, shipped, delivered to stores, gotten on the radio, hyped, marketed, worked in very complicated ways that no longer have any relevance. I mean, when people collect vinyl now, they go into a Walmart and they buy like a Taylor Swift album for $35. That's not the business that you were in at all.
Right.
You were shipping, mega boxes on trailer trucks of Michael Jackson product. With the air quotes. It's both a book about Michael Jackson, a book about you, and it's also a book about what the record industry was back in the 90s. And I found that fascinating. I also found a lot of things in the book that were facts about Michael Jackson you would never imagine to have been true. I mean, just some of the things that happened. There's a story, as probably some people may remember, there was a lyrical issue with the song They Don't Know About Us, where he used the word kike. And, there was obviously some concern on the part of the label that this was going to alienate people and, cause problems. And Michael obviously didn't, from reading your book, Michael didn't really understand what the problem was. And then you had to finally persuade him to go back in the studio and re-record it with a different lyric. And that didn't work out so well. You got him in the studio and he was not happy about that at all.
Right.
That's an amazing story.
Jim Morey and I was waiting at the studio, and Jim came, who's co-manager of Michael, and he came with Michael. And I met him in the lobby, and we had to walk down this long, long hallway to the studio. And Michael didn't say a word, just straight ahead. And Jim and I made eye contact like, oh boy. We got him in the studio. We had the engineer there who knew what we were doing. We were, was going to re-record the vocal in just a couple of spots.
A punch-in.
Yeah, punching in. And we had a video camera that I could give to the publicity department so they could give it to the media to say, see, he did it, he re-recorded it. Michael had, a couple of weeks before, agreed to this, and I was designated to speak to the media on background. So I'm telling the most angry people about this that he's going to go in and do it. And then all of a sudden it wasn't happening. And I got furious. I was upset because it's like, wait a minute. Now I look like, and the record company looks like we're lying. We're being straightforward about this. So it's, Michael, you've got to do it, So anyway, we end up in the studio, and Michael said to the engineer, play the song all the way through. Punch me in here, punch me out, but keep it playing, okay? The song comes into the part where he gets punched in. He sings the line to change the lyric, punched out, and then Michael started throwing things. There were all these music stands in there, and he's throwing them against the wall and knocking over, these big stand-up baffle boards. Jim and I were just so, number one, the pressure of getting him in the studio. I think we were just so in amazement of what was going on. We both started laughing. We're in the control room, and the engineer and the guy shooting the video are looking at us like, what's going on here?
What's funny about this?
People are laughing. Michael's throwing stuff, When it came to the second punch in, Michael stops throwing stuff, sings the line, punched out, and then he starts throwing things again. He's making a statement to us. I'm not happy about this.
Petulance.
So he walked out of the studio, didn't say a word. We walked him down. I said goodbye, and it was done. The decision to do that, I believe, was the right one. But I understood how he felt. He felt he was the voice of people that were called those names. But as I explained to him, those words are still hurtful to people. He never made the comparison to people using the N-word on records, but other people did and say, hey, one is equal to the other.
Yeah, but for a pop artist, that kind of language is unacceptable. I mean, it's one thing on a hip-hop record or, rock record, but, for a pop artist, you have to be kind of like PG rated.
Right. And in
those days, not anymore.
I heard this secondhand, thirdhand, that Janet had encouraged him to. He also did an F word at the end of one song, I think on Scream, and I think Janet encouraged him to do that.
For a lot of pop artists, it's a challenge to be what you're not.
Well, yeah, exactly. At the time, the parental warning stickers came out.
Yeah.
So if you were a rap act and you didn't have that sticker on, nobody wanted to buy your album.
Right, no street cred.
So the sticker became a marketing tool.
Mm-hmm. But not for a pop artist.
But some pop artists wanted to do it. I remember Till Tuesday, did something vocally on a record because they thought they needed it to be an adult act.
But with Michael Jackson, you run the risk of having, a record that people won't let their 13-year-olds bring into the house.
Well, that's it. And that's one of the things that I explained to Michael. He wanted to use a provocative photo on You're Not Alone. Mm-hmm. And I explained to him, again, this is in the middle of the night, we're in a trailer on the video shoot. I said, Michael, this is a ballad, and you got to think about your audience. I said, this is not, one of your upbeat, hard songs. This is a ballad. You've got children who are your fans. And I said, you realize that more than anybody. And he said, you're right. I need to change the idea. Believe me, because he would get so excited about an idea. I was really worried that I couldn't get him off that, but he did.
But maybe in that case, he didn't really understand how he appealed to children and what he should offer to children.
Yeah, exactly. He was just thinking of this concept of, you saw the cover shot, and then when you open it up, there was this reveal,
right.
And it was like, I get the concept, it's just the wrong place to use it.
The wrong audience. Direct opposite to the studio tantrum is the experience you had with him in Trump Tower when he had an apartment there. and you needed photographs selected for the history CD booklet, and you and an art director, and he spent the entire night going through photos. That's an amazing story. I mean, the fact that anybody would do that, much less somebody who is as famous and as successful and as powerful as Michael Jackson.
Michael was remarkable that night. We went from like 6:30 on a Friday evening to 9:30 the next morning. I spoke to Nancy Donald, who was the art director, and she reminded me that the cook actually made something for us that we took a break. I'm not sure I ate, but we went all night long. For Nancy and I, we knew if we didn't finish that night, getting him back to have the time to go through those photos, it might have been a couple of months, and that would have pushed the album. And of course, senior management
disaster
flipped out.
Yeah,
So,
but just the idea that Michael Jackson wouldn't have something 100 times more important in his mind that he had to do.
When he was focused on doing something, he was focused. He really did it. But that night, Nancy and I would hold up photos, like flashcards. She'd hold up one and he'd respond, and then I'd hold up one, he'd respond, and of course the responses were okay, which meant he didn't have to use it. But if he loved a picture, he'd say, must have or will die. And we'd chuckle and we put it on the save list. But then we had to go back through, because here was Michael looking through that night through his entire lifetime, pictures, and many of them that he'd forgotten about. Sure. And when he saw him again, we got to see him like, oh, wow, responding to just seeing an image from years past.
And the apartment that you visited him in to do this was in Trump Tower on
Yes.
Fifth Avenue in New York. And as you were leaving, he said something kind of surprising to you.
I believe we actually had the conversation twice. One time when I was there solo, I made the comment to him at one or the other of those meetings to say, Michael, great digs. Here you are. I said, right across the street from my office. This is great. And we were kind of on the edge of the kitchen, and he kind of moved into the kitchen a little bit. And he said, yeah, but Dan, I think the place is bugged. And then he pointed to a picture in that next room where he said, my security people think there's cameras. There was all this thought that, we knew Joe Jackson was paranoid and suspicious, and that Michael might have inherited a little bit of that. And so I just thought maybe he's a little paranoid, but I think it might have been an effort to get some compromise on Michael, and his security people checked it out, and I believe that's probably what happened.
One of my favorite stories in the book is a trailer film that he was making for the history album, where they went to Hungary, and basically they started calling you in the middle of the night to say, we need to approve a budget item, all the time. And my favorite one, well, you pointed out that Michael Jackson's audience might be a little surprised by having a marching army of only white people. Yes. And so you suggested they should get some people of color, and they couldn't find any. They thought they would find them in Hungary, and it's like not really ethnically logical.
It was one of the things that I insisted upon before they left, when we were reviewing the storyboard. There were two issues that I had. I said, one, if you're using banners and things, you have to make sure there is no symbols or something that is interpreted in another language that is offensive. Mm-hmm. Because I said, he appeals to people in 100 countries. Right. You got to look through everything. And the other issue was the marching army. Right. Yes. They came back to me and said, yeah, we're struggling, but we found some Turks that we can bus in. And I said, African-American people and Turks, I don't think that's going to work, They came back to me and said, we found a paratrooper group from England. And I said, great, and they said, we got a bargain. They're paratroopers, so they have a plane. So they're going to put the plane in as part of the budget, and it's really, really inexpensive. In the meantime, they're cranking the budget like crazy, I said, well, fax me a budget, and we'll look it over. And so they fax me a budget, and it has the cost for the individual people in it, and the flight and the crew and blah, blah, blah. And then they also had the ground transportation when they got to Hungary. I knew these people were just winding us up for money. So when I got the budget and I said, okay, and it looked pretty good for what we had to do. We were getting like 19 people that could be in the film. So I said, okay, this budget looks pretty good, but I have one issue. And they said, what? And I said, I want you to take out the ground transportation in Hungary. They said, what do you mean? I said, well, they're paratroopers. Can't you just have them jump out of the plane? And I just wanted to wind them up for what they were doing.
What a genius freestyle improvisation on your part in the middle of the night.
Well, what happens to you in the middle of the night is your mind just explodes.
Yeah, that's amazing. One of the other things you mentioned, and kind of in passing in the book, is that people at Epic Records who worked with Michael knew that his voice wasn't always that shy, mild falsetto that most of his audience had heard him speak during like press conferences and interviews and award shows and things like that. What was his other voice like?
Soft. I've heard some people make reference to kind of a third voice, which I never heard, but basically he just had a nice, soft voice, but it was down an octave. And it wasn't low, it was just a soft, nice voice.
And why do you think he affected the other voice, the higher voice?
I don't know if it was a defensive, vehicle for him or what, just, again, I think part of his idiosyncrasies. That's all I could imagine,
You've woven a lot of your own personal memoir, not a lot, some personal memoir into the story because obviously it's about your intersection with Michael Jackson, but it's not completely excluded from the rest of your life. You write about having children, and you write about your wife, and you write about your family and your mother and father. And one of the most tender, touching moments in the whole book is Michael Jackson saying something very personal to you during a completely unrelated stretch of time when you're sitting in a trailer with him, and how it affected you. And I found that very touching in the book because it connects Michael Jackson, your experience with Michael Jackson, and your own personal life.
It was, again, in the middle of the night. And we're on the set, You Are Not Alone, and we were shooting in a park and somewhere east of Los Angeles. And we had a Winnebago. We knew we were going to be out there all night long. And Michael had a Winnebago, and they were back to back. And Michael and I intended to look at photos that night for the single, and I actually needed to get the artwork in that morning.
Once again,
so
rushing
it was
to get artwork done.
Right up against the wall. So Michael had all these shots. He called his staff and he said, "Hey, can somebody go down and get X photos?"
In the middle of the night.
Yes.
In the middle of nowhere, in the middle of East Los Angeles.
So somebody went to the office and then had to drive 25 miles out to where we were with the photos. So in the meantime, Michael and I are meeting, and we've got this delay before the photos came. So we were just chatting, and somewhere along the line, he asked me about my father. I explained to him about my father. My father was a kind of a blue-collar foreman, very hard-working guy, World War II vet, that kind of thing. And saying, hey, my dad is not perfect, but I learned a lot in life from him and the whole thing, So anyway, we went on to other topics, and then the photos came, and we went through those. And then we got a call for Michael to go to the set to shoot. So I said, Michael, I'll leave for you to get ready, and I'll see you out on the set. I'm going out the door, and Michael said, "Hey, Dan." I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Tell your dad I said hello." And whoa, boy, I walked out of there. It was like 15 feet back to the door to the Epic Winnebago. And I walked in, and Scott Spanchek, who's our production VP, was there. And he said, "Dan, you look like you just saw a ghost." I said, just got hit with this just really personal thing, and Michael never in that conversation said anything negative about his own dad or anything like that, which many of us have heard over the years.
And he told Oprah a lot about.
Yeah, but it was just, pretty unique. We were going home for Thanksgiving, and my dad and I were sitting in the living room, and he had one of those easy chairs, the
recliners.
Yeah, the recliners. And he's sitting there, and he's got the oxygen on and the whole thing. I got to thinking about what Michael said, and I said, "Hey, Dad, I work with Michael Jackson," and I said, "He wanted me to tell you." He said hello, and my dad never said a word. Mm-hmm. He just cocked his head like, wow, what was that all about?
Yeah, well, as you did.
That weekend was the last I saw my dad. He passed away a couple of months later. But I'm so happy that I actually was able to tell him that. And I think it ultimately said to my father that Michael knew he'd been a great dad to me, And
it also says to the world that Michael Jackson could be kind enough to offer a gift to somebody that he'd never met.
Absolutely. It was just awesome,
Most people who give Michael Jackson thought, have a very strong opinion about whether he was wrongly accused of crimes or whether he was a guilty party and whether he was just a horrible person who did terrible things. And it's important, I think, to you and in the book that you don't judge him, because you acknowledge repeatedly that you have no inside knowledge of his personal life, that you never saw him do anything untoward to anybody. And your one major experience with him with children was when he had the Make-A-Wish Foundation bring a bunch of children with terminal illnesses to the Neverland Ranch, and he was generous and kind and sweet and friendly and solicitous towards them. So I think it's important in the book that you don't take a position. And I wonder, with all the time you've had to reflect in writing the book and stuff like that, have you had any further thoughts about that, or do you still feel like you're kind of a Switzerland in this subject?
I've thought about it 100 times. We don't know about anybody's life. But the one thing that I've always felt is that I've worked with a lot of artists over the years and hear stories about other people. And Michael was an oddball to many people. And I think part of this, whatever he did or didn't do, is that he got bullied about it. Mm-hmm. And because he was odd, he was different. And, you think about all these rock bands and stuff that was going on. There's probably 50 bands we could say, I wonder what they were doing. On the record kind of situation, Bill Wyman from the Rolling Stones in his 40s was dating a 14-year-old,
yeah.
And of course Jerry Lee Lewis marrying his 13-year-old cousin or whatever.
And Jimmy Page had a 15-year-old girlfriend.
And it's just like, so that kind of enters the picture in how do you judge, And the one thing we always heard about, secondhand through the 80s were how many legal issues that his office had to deal with. People saying, "Oh, I wrote that song," and a lot of bogus cases. There was one in Chicago about him quote stealing a song, and when the court really heard the case, it was like, "Come on, just throw this stuff out." There was a certain sense that you had that there's a lot of people trying to take advantage, and I thought that about the people around Michael, that I thought there were some kind of strange people around him that I always thought he felt sorry for, and that's why they were around. And then the other people that he had around were true professionals, the best,
to him.
In people that he worked with. But the other thing that over the years, continually that I've heard with people who did work with him in all kinds of different capacities, no one ever, those people all say, I never saw him. And why would we really,
Yeah.
So
privacy is privacy.
Yeah. What I do remember from the shoot that we did with the Make-A-Wish people is that what was remarkable to me is how much time Michael spent with the parents and they were losing their child, you know. And so, you know, Micah was doing his thing with the kids, but it was like, it's easy to do the things with the kids. You know, I'm going to take them into the game room and they're going to start playing games. Right. Micah would come out and put his arm around a mom and say, how you doing? You know, how you getting through this? I just thought he showed phenomenal empathy and leadership. And that's why I hope one day that footage that we shot that day comes out, because it's a whole different look at Michael. It's like, oh my God, whoever he was, whatever he did that day, he was unbelievable. He was everything those families could ever want. You know, people are complicated.
That's for sure. You've Got Michael is out now. You can get it from Amazon. You can get it from trouserpressbooks.com. You can get it from various digital platforms. And you can go into your local Barnes & Noble and ask them to order it for you. Or you can go to your library and ask them to order it for you. So keep on pushing. And let me say thank you to Dan Beck, not only for sitting with me today, but for writing this wonderful book and allowing me to publish it. And Trouser Press Books, this is our podcast, and we're out.
Thank you, Ira. Thanks so much. And thanks for publishing the book.